"Remove that from your neck." The voice, sharp and imperious, cut through the hushed stillness of the courtroom. It belonged to Judge Marcus Thorne, a man whose black robes seemed an extension of his own rigid certainty. He peered down from his elevated bench, his gaze falling upon the defendant, an old man standing alone before him. The old man did not flinch. He simply stood there, his shoulders slightly stooped with age, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. A simple, faded blue ribbon was draped around his neck, and from it hung a small, star-shaped piece of metal. It rested against a worn, gray button-down shirt, a stark contrast to the polished wood and imposing flags that flanked the judge's seat. The air in the room, already thick with the scent of old paper and sterile procedure, grew heavy with a new tension. The defendant, Samuel Keene, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no defiance, only a quiet weariness. He had a face etched with lines that spoke not of anger, but of a long acquaintance with hardship. He had been called to answer for a series of unpaid citations regarding the state of his small, dilapidated house, peeling paint, a fence in disrepair. It was a mundane affair, the kind of bureaucratic housekeeping that filled Judge Thorne's docket day after day. But the medal changed everything. To the judge, it was an affront, a piece of unapproved ornamentation, a theatrical prop brought into his sanctum to curry sympathy or, worse, to subtly mock the court's authority. "Sir, this is a place of law and order, not a parade ground," Judge Thorne continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Whatever that bauble is, it has no place here. Remove it, or I will have the bailiff remove it for you." The bailiff, a large man with a perpetually bored expression, shifted his weight, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. The spectators in the gallery murmured, their whispers rustling like dry leaves. Some nodded in agreement with the judge's stern command for decorum. Others stared at the old man with a flicker of pity, seeing a frail figure being needlessly admonished. Samuel Keene's gaze did not waver. His voice, when it came, was soft, yet it carried across the silent room with surprising clarity. "I can't do that, Your Honor." Judge Thorne's eyebrows shot up. "You can't. Or you won't." The distinction was critical in his world of precise legal language. One implied inability, the other, defiance. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his bench, the polished wood reflecting his stern visage. "Let me be perfectly clear, Mr. Keene. In this room, my instructions are not suggestions. They are orders. Your financial difficulties and the disrepair of your property are the matters at hand. Any attempt to introduce sentimentality into these proceedings is unwelcome and, I assure you, will be ineffective. Now, for the final time, take off that necklace." He gestured dismissively with a flick of his wrist, as if shooing away an insect. Samuel's hands, weathered and knotted with arthritis, remained clasped. One of them was covered by a simple leather glove, a detail that went largely unnoticed. He looked at the American flag standing to the judge's right, its colors vibrant under the fluorescent lights. Then he looked back at the judge. The medal on his chest seemed to catch the light, a faint glint of gold against the worn fabric of his shirt. It was not ostentatious. It was small, humble even, yet it possessed a gravity that the judge, in his insulated world of statutes and precedents, could not comprehend. "It's not a necklace, sir," Samuel said, his voice still quiet, still respectful. "And I mean no disrespect to you or this court. But I cannot remove it." A ripple of shock went through the gallery. This was no longer about a simple dress code violation. This was a direct challenge. The judge's face hardened, his jaw tightening. He saw a stubborn old man, probably a veteran of some minor conflict decades ago, clinging to a trinket as a shield against accountability. He had seen it before, men who believed their past service gave them a pass on present responsibilities. It was a line of reasoning he found particularly offensive. Service was to be respected, yes, but it was not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It did not exempt one from municipal codes or, more importantly, from the absolute authority of his court. The bailiff took a half-step forward, his posture now alert, ready to act on the judge's command. The tension in the room coiled tighter, a palpable thing that seemed to suck the very air from the space. "You are trying my patience, Mr. Keene," Judge Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You stand here cited for violations that affect the community, for allowing your property to fall into a state of neglect. And your response is to stand in contempt of a direct order. You believe that thing, grants you some special privilege?" He pointed a finger at Samuel, the gesture sharp and accusatory. "What is it, anyway? Some VFW award? A trinket you won in a local parade?" The insult hung in the air, crude and dismissive. Samuel's expression did not change, but a deep sadness settled in his eyes. He wasn't angry. He was something far beyond anger. He felt a profound sense of sorrow for the man on the bench, a man so draped in the symbols of justice but so blind to the meaning of honor. He had not worn the medal for the judge, or for the court, or for anyone's pity. He had worn it for the men who couldn't. Today was the anniversary. The day of the fire and the screaming, the day the world had been reduced to a churned, bloody hilltop in a country whose name most people had long forgotten. The medal was not his. He was merely its custodian. It belonged to the ghosts who walked with him every day, whose voices he heard in the quiet of the night. How could he explain that to a man who saw only a bauble and a challenge to his authority? "Your Honor," Samuel began, his voice raspy with an emotion he fought to control, "with all due respect, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," the judge snapped back, his voice rising in volume, his face flushing with indignation. "I understand that you are disrupting these proceedings. I understand that you are showing a shocking lack of respect for this institution. And I understand that you are about to be held in contempt of court, which will involve a fine you likely cannot pay and a short stay in a holding cell. Is that what you want, Mr. Keene? Is your pride really worth that?" The crowd was silent now, all eyes fixed on the confrontation. The quiet dignity of the old man against the sputtering rage of the powerful judge. It was a deeply uncomfortable spectacle. The judge slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "That's it. I've had enough of this nonsense. Bailiff, escort Mr. Keene to the holding area. He can sit there and contemplate the consequences of his foolish pride. We will revisit his citations when he is prepared to show this court the proper respect." The bailiff began his slow walk toward the defendant's table. Samuel Keene did not brace himself. He did not protest. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, a silent prayer or a final resignation passing through him. The worn leather of his glove creaked as he tightened his fist. He had survived far worse than a judge's anger. He had survived things that men like Marcus Thorne could not even imagine in their worst nightmares. Humiliation was a small price to pay for keeping a sacred promise. He had worn the medal for them, for the boys of Alpha Company who never came home. He wore it on this day every year to remember them, to carry their weight for them. Removing it would be a betrayal far greater than any contempt of court. As the bailiff reached him, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder, the main doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound was not loud, but in the suffocating silence, it was momentous. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, his figure ramrod straight, his presence radiating an authority that was not robed or gilded, but earned. He wore the uniform of a 4-star general of the United States Army, his chest a constellation of ribbons and medals that told the story of a lifetime of service. He paused for a moment, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before him, the enraged judge, the advancing bailiff, and the quiet, elderly man with the simple blue ribbon around his neck. And on that ribbon, the general's eyes locked onto the small, 5-pointed star. His breath caught in his throat. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, shifting from impassive observation to one of profound, almost shocking reverence. The courtroom remained oblivious, its attention still fixed on the drama at the front. The general, Wallace Vance, had been at the courthouse to deliver a keynote address for a judicial conference being held in the adjacent hall. He had stepped out for a moment of quiet, and the muffled sound of the judge's gavel had drawn him to the courtroom door. He had only intended a brief, curious glance. But what he saw made him forget the conference, his speech, everything. He saw a desecration in progress. He saw a man of immense power about to commit an act of profound ignorance and disrespect. Without a second thought, he strode into the room. His polished dress shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step a sharp, rhythmic report that cut through the tension. Heads began to turn. Whispers rippled through the gallery as people recognized the uniform, the 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders. Judge Thorne, annoyed by the interruption, looked up with a scowl. "This is a closed session. Who are you?" "State your business." General Vance did not even glance at the judge. His eyes were fixed on Samuel Keene. He walked with a purpose that commanded the space, parting the air before him. The bailiff, seeing the uniform and the 4 stars, froze in place, his hand falling from Samuel's shoulder as if it had been burned. He instinctively straightened his own posture, a flicker of his own long-forgotten military training resurfacing. The general stopped about 10 feet from Samuel Keene. He looked at the old man's weary face, at the worn shirt, and at the Medal of Honor resting against his chest. He saw not a defendant in contempt, but a titan of American history standing in a place where he was not understood. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to see what this powerful, uniformed man would do. The judge, flustered and irritated, opened his mouth to demand an explanation, to reassert his control over his domain. But no words came out. He was silenced by what happened next, an act so simple, so powerful, it shattered the reality of his courtroom. General Wallace Vance brought his heels together with an audible click. His body went rigid. He raised his right hand in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to slice the air. It was not a casual gesture. It was the salute of a 4-star general to a superior. It was an act of deference, of respect so profound it was almost worship. He held the salute, his gaze locked on Samuel Keene, his face a mask of unwavering reverence. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The bailiff snapped to attention, his own hand flying up in a salute. Even the court reporter, a woman who had seen everything, lowered her hands from her stenotype machine, her mouth agape. Judge Thorne stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. A 4-star general was saluting the disheveled old man he had just threatened to throw in a cell. It made no sense. The world had been turned upside down. Samuel Keene slowly opened his eyes, which had been closed in resignation. He saw the general, the salute, the look of utter respect in his eyes. A single tear traced a path through the weathered lines on his cheek. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Finally, General Vance lowered his hand. He took 2 more steps forward and addressed the old man, his voice a low rumble of emotion that filled the now sacred silence of the room. "Mr. Keene," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "It is an honor, sir." A profound honor. He then turned his head, his eyes, now as hard as granite, fixing on Judge Thorne. The full weight of his 4-star command presence descended upon the bench. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cold and deliberate, "do you have any idea who this man is?" The judge was speechless, his face pale. He could only shake his head mutely. "Do you have any idea," the general continued, his voice rising with controlled fury, "what that bauble around his neck is?" He pointed not at the medal, but at Samuel Keene himself. "This man is Corporal Samuel Keene, United States Army. And that is not a trinket. That is the Medal of Honor." The word struck the room like a thunderclap. The Medal of Honor. The nation's highest, most sacred award for valor in combat. An award so rare, so revered, that by military tradition, even 4-star generals are required to salute the recipient, regardless of rank. The whispers in the gallery erupted into a wave of shocked understanding. People looked at the quiet old man with new eyes, seeing not a pitiable defendant, but a hero of unimaginable stature. Judge Thorne sank back in his chair, the color draining completely from his face. The arrogance, the certainty, the righteous indignation, it all evaporated, replaced by a sickening, horrifying wave of shame. He looked at the medal, truly seeing it for the first time. The simple blue ribbon, patterned with 13 white stars. The golden eagle suspended from a bar engraved with the word valor, the 5-pointed star itself. It was the authentic symbol of a courage he could not possibly fathom. This man, General Vance continued, his voice now a powerful oratorical force, his attention still locked on the judge but his words meant for everyone in the room, is here today because of a citation for peeling paint. Let me tell you about the last time he was surrounded by things that were peeling and falling apart. The general took a half step back, creating a stage. He was no longer just a soldier, he was a storyteller, a guardian of a sacred history. On October 12, 1968, on a godforsaken piece of ground known as Hill 488, then Private First Class Keene's platoon was ambushed and overrun by an enemy force 10 times their size. They were cut off, surrounded, with no hope of reinforcement until dawn, if they could even survive that long. His voice was measured, respectful, painting a picture of chaos and desperation that stood in stark contrast to the orderly courtroom. The platoon leader was killed in the first volley. The sergeants fell soon after. Command broke down. It was a slaughter. But in the midst of that horror, one man refused to break. Private Keene, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, single-handedly rallied the few survivors. He dragged the wounded to a shallow depression in the rock, shielding them with his own body while returning fire. His M16 ran out of ammunition, so he crawled under fire to a fallen comrade, retrieved his weapon, and continued to fight. He was wounded in the leg by shrapnel, but he tied a strip of his own shirt around it and kept fighting. The general's voice was filled with a raw, powerful emotion. He was not reading from a report, he was channeling the very soul of the story. The courtroom was utterly still, the only sound the general's resonant voice. Samuel Keene stood with his head bowed, not in shame, but as if bearing a great weight. He was not hearing the general's words, he was hearing the gunfire, the screams of his friends. He was back on that hill. For 6 hours, the general boomed, 6 hours in the dark, with mortars raining down and enemy soldiers charging their position. Samuel Keene held them off. He moved from position to position, firing, throwing grenades, shouting encouragement to the few men still alive. He was shot in the shoulder. He was stabbed in the arm during a close-quarters assault that he repelled with his bare hands and a bayonet. The general paused and looked directly at Samuel's gloved hand. The unspoken truth hung in the air. By the time the sun came up and a relief force finally broke through, they found him. He was unconscious, lying atop the bodies of 3 enemy soldiers, his weapon empty, still clutching the radio handset he had used to call in air support on his own position. Of the 36 men in his platoon, only 5 survived. Every single one of them testified that they were alive for one reason and one reason only: Samuel Keene. He saved them all. The story settled over the room, a heavy, sacred shroud. The peeling paint, the unpaid fines, it all seemed so obscenely trivial now. The man who had been admonished for his appearance was a giant. The judge who had wielded his petty power was revealed to be a man of profound smallness. Judge Thorne stared at his hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His entire world, his sense of order and justice, had been irrevocably fractured. He had built his career on the foundation of law, on the idea that rules and procedures were the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong. But in the face of Samuel Keene's sacrifice, his laws seemed like meaningless ink on paper. What was the fine for contempt of court compared to the price this man had paid? What was a jail cell compared to the hell he had endured on that hill? The general's voice softened, but lost none of its power. He wears that medal today, Your Honor, because October 12th is the day he lost his entire platoon. He doesn't wear it as a mark of pride. He wears it as a tombstone for 31 men who never came home. He wears it so they are not forgotten. He wears it for them, not for himself. And you ordered him to take it off. The final words were not an accusation. They were a verdict. A judgment far more profound than any Thorne had ever delivered from his bench. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence of shame, of awe, of a deep and collective reckoning. Then, slowly, from the back of the gallery, a man stood up. He was an older man in a business suit. Then a woman next to him stood. And another, and another. Soon, the entire gallery was on its feet, their faces turned toward Samuel Keene, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and overwhelming respect. They stood not for the judge, not for the general, but for the quiet, unassuming hero in their midst. Judge Thorne, his face ashen, slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. His robed figure, which once seemed so imposing, now looked small and hollow. He looked at Samuel Keene, truly looked at him, and for the first time in his life, he felt the utter inadequacy of his own position. He opened his mouth, his voice a choked whisper. "Mr. Keene. I am," he couldn't finish the sentence. The words, "I'm sorry," felt like pebbles in the face of a mountain. But Samuel Keene looked up, his weary eyes meeting the judge's. There was no anger in them. There was no triumph, no satisfaction at the judge's humiliation. There was only a deep, abiding grace. He offered a small, sad smile. "You didn't know, Your Honor," he said softly. His voice was a balm in the wounded room. It was an act of forgiveness so complete, so unearned, that it was more stunning than the story of his heroism. He was not just a man of courage, but a man of profound mercy. He turned slightly to face the general. "Thank you, General." "But that was a long time ago." General Vance shook his head. "Honor, Mr. Keene, doesn't have an expiration date." He then turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to pay Mr. Keene's fines. All of them. And I have a number of men at the local army base who would consider it the highest privilege to volunteer their time to repair this man's home to a standard befitting a national hero." Judge Thorne could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He waved his hand in a gesture of dismissal, not at Samuel, but at the case file, at the entire petty proceeding. The case was dismissed. The charges were gone. As the general gently placed a hand on Samuel's back to guide him away, Samuel stopped. He looked at the judge, at the pale, shaken man on the bench. "Justice," Samuel said, his voice quiet but clear, "is about seeing the whole person, I think. Not just the part that's broken." He then allowed the general to lead him toward the doors. As they passed, every person in the aisle stepped back, clearing a path, their heads bowed in respect. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving the courtroom in a state of stunned silence. Judge Marcus Thorne remained standing for a long time, alone in his cavern of polished wood and leather-bound books. His gaze fell upon the American flag beside his bench. He had looked at it every day for 20 years, but he had never truly seen it until today. He saw not a symbol of a nation's power, but a testament to the sacrifice of quiet men like Samuel Keene, the true pillars who held the entire structure up, hidden in plain sight, asking for nothing in return. His gavel lay on the bench, a useless piece of wood, a symbol of an authority that now felt meaningless. The real power, the real honor, had just walked out of his courtroom.